Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Good Governance Africa's public webinar titled The Zimbabwe Crisis from Revolt to Reform. My name is Chris Maruleng, and I am the Executive Director of Good Governance Africa. Just in case you're wondering, Good Governance Africa is a regional applied policy research and advocacy think tank that is based in Johannesburg, South Africa, and we have centers in a number of places across our continent. And if you want to find out more about Good Governance Africa, please feel free to go to our website and check out www.gga.org.za. Our key mandate really is to improve governance performance across the continent. And certainly, I'm sure a lot of you are asking, what do we understand as governance? Well, in a nutshell, it is about the authoritative allocation of resources. And what does that mean further? It's really about who gets what, when, and how. And this authoritative allocation of resources on our continent normally ends up in situations where political and economic elites act in their best interests in a self-serving ways. That is normally what we call bad governance. And certainly we at Good Governance Africa are interested in ensuring that the processes and systems around the authoritative allocation of resources occurs in ways that are more aligned to what we describe as good governance. So when we talk about these elites, very often they form state systems that are described as the predatory state, where in actual fact, the state, which is ultimately supposed to ensure effective governance and delivery of services to the people, acts in ways that are not aligned to ensuring that the citizens of the state receive the benefits that one would expect in a democracy. Anthony Downs calls this issue, or this question that I just raised, as the issue attention cycle. And in order for us to move away from protest to program, as is kind of suggested in the title of our program, which is Zimbabwe Crisis from Revolt to Reform, it requires us really to think effectively and generate, let's call it a solutions-based system around governance that can help us arrive at solutions to these multifaceted crises. This is particularly the case in Zimbabwe, which has faced a long-term governance crisis that is described as multifaceted and complex. However, in order for us to understand and really try and arrive at solutions to this crisis, we have compiled a very illustrious panel today to help us think through some of these complex issues that face Zimbabwe, in the hope that we as Good Governance Africa can deliver certain solutions to what we have really seen as a long-term crisis affecting that country. So when we talk of this panel of speakers, we have brought together, as I have said, quite an amazing panel of speakers today. And let me introduce them very quickly. Our first speaker will be Thandekile Moyo, who is a Zimbabwean writer and human rights activist. She is currently based in Zimbabwe. She'll be followed by Justina Mokoko, who's director for the Zimbabwe Peace Project. And of course, we will be joined by Professor Nick Cheeseman, who is Professor of Democracy at the University of Birmingham. We will then have Dr. Ibo Mandaza, who is the director of the Southwest Trust and a renowned author and publisher in Zimbabwe. And then, of course, last but not least, we are joined by MP, the Honorable Tendai Biti, who is the Vice President of the MDC Alliance, which is an opposition party in Zimbabwe. We encourage you, if you have any questions during the course of our debate today, to use the Q&A icon, which is on the Zoom platform. And that way we'll be able to curate and ask questions from the floor on your behalf. So without further ado, let me invite none other than Ms. Thandekile Moyo to present to us today her opening views on the situation in Zimbabwe and what the possible solutions to this long-term, multifaceted crisis that we talk of could be. Over to you, Thandekile.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. I'm just going to get right into it. So the situation in Zimbabwe right now is a situation where we have a country that has had conflict after conflict and no real efforts to address those conflicts. So you find that Zimbabwe itself was a result founded on the independence we got after the war with Rhodesia. So during that war, so many atrocities were committed. Civilians were murdered, abused by soldiers from both parties. So I'm going to focus on transitional justice, which is the way in which countries try to get out of a conflict situation, how countries get out of conflict situation, try and address injustices that happened during that conflict. So when we look at the Zimbabwean situation and we look at 1980, where we gained independence from Rhodesia, we realize that we gained independence and amnesty was given to all the people that perpetrated injustices against the people. So you have to ask yourself, when independence came, did we really have an effort that centered on the victims of the crimes that were committed? Because transitional justice has to put victims first. But what we did in 1980 was we put the perpetrators first by giving them a blanket amnesty for everything that they had done. So all those mothers whose girl children would be taken into the mountains by the soldiers whenever the soldiers camped in their villages, never got justice for all those things. The girls themselves that were raped, the men that were killed, accused of being sellouts, there was never any justice. The victims were just completely ignored after the end of the war. Straight after the war, we had Gukurahundi, the genocide that killed 20,000 or more civilians in Matabeleland. I'm not doing much on that one, but come 1987, the two leaders, Joshua Nkomo of ZAPU and Robert Mugabe, decided we want to put an end to this conflict, and there was the Unity Accord. But then again, this Unity Accord was not centered on victims. What it went on to do was to give amnesty to the perpetrators of all the injustices that happened between 1983 and 1987. 20,000 people murdered and nobody prosecuted for it. All the women that were raped, all the men and the children that were disappeared, there was never any justice for them. Instead, these two leaders sat down, and for whatever reason, Nkomo is said to have been pushed by the pressure to end the conflict and stop the killing of his people. Mugabe wanted to maintain his one-party state. For those two to achieve what they wanted, victims were ignored and the country continued. So all those pains, people moved on with the pains from the Gukurahundi situation. Come 1990, we have elections, and then there's this, the conflict with Zoom, Edgar Tekere's party. Zoom members were murdered. We had the case of Kombai in Gweru, who was shot. The people that shot him were known. What does Mugabe go and do after the election? He gives amnesty to the two people that shot Kombai, and nobody was ever arrested for all the other murders that occurred. So Zimbabwe then moved on. So now this is different groups of wounded people moving on from one conflict to another. We have the group that was wounded during the war, the group that was wounded during Kukurahundi. Now 1990, we have another group from another place being wounded. Come 2000, we have the farm invasions. Farm invasions happened, Zimbabweans were happy to get their land back, but they happened on the backdrop of conflict. Many people were killed for those farms to be taken and for the land to be given back to Zimbabwe. But there was never any justice effort. Nobody was ever punished for the crimes that were perpetrated. And so also during 2000 is the time that we had the first election with the MDC. And there was all the violence that was perpetrated against the MDC members. 2002, we had the presidential election, violence again, and no justice for it whatsoever, no effort to say, okay, fine, Mugabe has won the election, ZANU-PF is now in power. But for us to get to this point where we are at now, people were murdered, crimes were committed, people were fighting. Injustice doesn't necessarily, the injustices were not necessarily perpetrated by ZANU-PF alone. We had some MDC people perpetrating injustices on ZANU-PF supporters, but these people are still living in the same communities. No effort to reconcile them was ever made. Come 2008, same story. We get to 2018, we're told there's a new dispensation. 1st of August, after the elections, people are shot and killed. Nobody's brought to justice. We had that Mohlante commission, but did it really bring any justice? Nobody was ever punished for all those things that happened. January 2019, same thing. Protesters were murdered, women were raped. And even now in 2020, we're still talking about abductions going on and all those things happening. So transitional justice is about accountability. When we look at Zimbabwe, can we really say there has been any accountability for any of the atrocities that have been committed? Can the Zimbabwean people really say they have faith in their government to protect their human rights? There's no faith. Why is there no faith? Because the perpetrator of all these injustices is the state. The state is the perpetrator of the injustice. The state has been perpetrating atrocity after atrocity for all these years. And the reason why there has been no transitional justice is because the perpetrator is still in power. But it's a chicken and egg situation as well. The reason why the perpetrator is still in power is because we, the people, never made an effort to that is wrong. People have been making an effort to demand accountability, but our efforts have not given us the accountability that we want. For the perpetrator to stop, they have to be stopped by the people from committing these atrocities. For as long as we do not stop them, they are going to continue. So transitional justice also looks at redress. It's mainly about giving victims back their dignity. So we are a broken country, a country of people that really have had all their dignity taken away from them. And the challenge in Zimbabwe right now is, if we say transitional justice is a process of countries transitioning from a period of conflict to a period of peace, can we talk about that in Zimbabwe while we're still in a state of conflict? We are still in a state of conflict. So what transitional justice are we talking about before we talk about how to end that conflict? So our focus, I believe, should be, we need to end the conflict first. We've got everything on paper on how to go about transitional justice processes. We have the NPRC. This is the National Peace and Reconciliation Commission. If you look at the functions of the NPRC, everything on paper, it's great. It means that Zimbabwe knows what to do. Zimbabwe knows that the truth must be told about all the injustices that were perpetrated. Zimbabwe knows that there has to be justice for all those injustices that were perpetrated. Zimbabwe knows that for there to be peace and reconciliation in the country, there has to be truth. But we are still in conflict. The injustices are still going on. So we have to find a way to stop the conflict. The NPRC itself it leaves a lot to be desired, because for many years after it was agreed that we need an NPRC, Mugabe did not appoint a chairperson. Emerson Mnangagwa came into power, he did appoint a chairperson, but he's going out of his way to himself undermine the work of the NPRC, because he's out there in Matabeleland with the Matabeleland collection, unilaterally trying to effect a transitional justice process led by him, a key perpetrator. So how the NPRC is supposed to work when the perpetrator himself is in power and is trying his best on his own process going on. So the NPRC on paper is good, but look at how the commissioners are picked as well. They're picked by the perpetrator. Transitional justice should be a collaborative effort between the victims and the new government. But now there's no new government. It's still the old government, and it's still the same victims. So we really have to find a way of saying, if there's no way to stop the conflict in Zimbabwe, let's at least address the past atrocities. How do we do that? The NPRC has to be an independent body, because what we're doing right now is building conflict upon conflict, and none of the injustices are resolved. So there's no peace in the country. There's no peace amongst us civilians who live with the same people that came to Matabeleland and perpetrated Kukurahundi on us. There is no peace in the villages where people are living, MDC people living with ZANU-PF people. There is no peace. So we need to find a way of having a National Peace and Reconciliation Commission that is independent and that can address past atrocities. Regardless of the fact that conflict is still going on, we can still try and address the conflict that has happened in the past. It has to be inclusive, this commission. So yeah, I think I've gone over time. And
you know, but you have gone over time, but you have really addressed some very fundamental issues related to transitional justice, and pointing out the fact that there appears over a number of generations to be a failure to transition away from conflict itself in Zimbabwe. And we see this as a continuation of conflict cycles in that country. But on that point, let me bring in Justina Mukoko here to try and get her view on her opening remarks on what she believes are the pressing issues around this really complex crisis. Justina?
Thank you very much, Chris, for this opportunity. And I'm going to focus on women as victims of human rights violations and how it's possible for women to be able to access justice. And I will begin by saying women have been victims of the entire spectrum of human rights violations in this country. And this is why we are talking about a crisis. They've been subjected to abductions. They've been subjected to rape, sexual assault, harassment, killing, assaults, torture, deprivation of livelihood, discrimination where food and other aid is distributed. They have also been subjected to arbitrary and unlawful arrests and extended periods of detention that are unjustified. They have been subjected to inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. They've been stripped of their dignity. Women have suffered as a result of the endemic corruption that this country is facing at this time, where they are unable to access services in health institutions, and at times even the right to education, they are unable to access that because resources of the state have just been depleted by the ongoing corruption that seems it seems it's not going to end, because everything that we are told seems that it's not addressing issues. And women have been afraid to approach the police. Afraid because the police have transformed some of the victims to perpetrators. Where someone approaches the police station, rather than look for the perpetrator, it's the victim who is then turned into a perpetrator. And as a result, women are afraid to approach police stations. And I think what we have seen in the few months is that abductions have been perpetrated in cahoots with the police. And women are afraid to approach the police because they are afraid of being abducted, because what comes with abduction is also torture, sexual assault, and the list is endless. And at the end of the day, you are then accused of having abducted yourself. And I think what we have also seen is that there is a thin line between the ruling party and state institutions. And in this particular aspect, I'm specifically talking about the police. They are working on behalf of a political party rather than to work to address and defend the rights of citizens as what is required under our constitution. And I think when we speak about abductions, there were 3 young women from the MDC Alliance who were abducted. Initially, they had been arrested, and the police spokesperson had confirmed that they had been arrested. But in no time, unprofessionally and unethically, he flip-flopped and said that he had never said that they had been arrested. And then we have seen that there have been sensitive photographs of these women that were taken in a bid to investigate the abduction. But we saw those photographs being shared on social media. We have also seen of late CCTV that was supposed to be evidence in court actually being put to the public gallery. And we have also seen the women being addressed by the most degrading of names. We have seen victims of abductions being body shamed. And we have also seen that people are arrested for the police to investigate. It's not the other way around. I'm not a lawyer, but I think our constitution does state that a suspect is supposed to be arrested when investigations have been done. But what we see is that investigations only happen when someone has been arrested. Section 52 of the Constitution guarantees the right to personal security, but for women, especially those who have elected to be political activists, human rights defenders, journalists, it's not guaranteed for them. And that also extends to women who are associated with men who are political activists, who are journalists, and those who have elected to be human rights defenders. They have been held as ransom when the state is looking for those men. And we have also seen that once someone is arrested, their rights as a person in detention are not respected. What we have actually seen is that once someone is arrested and they are sent to remand prison, they are assumed to have been convicted. We have seen them shackled, leg irons, handcuffs, the lot. What you would expect to see on dangerous criminals. This is done even for people who have handed themselves to the police because the police have indicated that they are looking for them. And this also applies to women. And we have also seen that people are denied food when they are incarcerated, and other conditions, even being able to speak to their lawyers in confidence. I will then now look at how it is possible for women to be able to access justice. I will begin by looking at rebuilding confidence and trust in state institutions, in particular the police. The Constitution speaks of a police service, but I think we are still aspiring to get to that. And for this, I will call them a police force in terms of what they have done to citizens. They can't be called a service, because when you've got a service, it's actually responsive to the people that it is serving. So I think the confidence and trust needs to be rebuilt if women are going to be able to access justice in terms of the human rights abuses that they have faced. And I think in terms of investigations, if investigations have to be done, they have to be done professionally, independently, and transparently. It doesn't make sense, actually, if those who are accused are then the investigators, they are the adjudicators of their own actions. At the end of the day, you can't really look at that and say that it is an investigation. And then the courts have got a responsibility and obligation of interpreting the law and also ensuring that victims access justice through fair trial. And I think the issue of presumption of innocence needs to be actually buttressed by the courts, because I think the way that things are going, it's actually losing its luster. And this actually works against what the Constitution actually speaks to. Independent commissions being my third point. I think Tandegile has also looked at the commissions. I think it's not business as usual. And when it's not business as usual, there is no way you can expect to be working normally. I think because we are in a crisis, we expect the commissions actually to be operating outside the box, within what is allowed by the Constitution. I don't think it makes sense for the commissions to wait for someone to come and make a complaint when they can see things that are happening. You can't allow your neighbor's house to burn to the ground when you are seeing that it is going up in flames. So they've got an obligation to be able to look at the issues that are affecting us at this time. And I think the issue of constitutionalism, there are rights that are guaranteed in our Constitution, and we need to go back to constitutionalism and the rule of law. And then looking at the AU, it's committed to the principle of subsidiarity, which also emphasizes the exhaustion of domestic remedies before someone goes on to regional and international remedies. But I think looking at the crisis that we have in Zimbabwe, there are other options that the government could adopt. Inviting special rapporteurs from the African Union. There is a rapporteur on the freedom of expression and access to information, on the rights of women. They could actually be engaged to come and look at the situation that we are facing at the moment. And there's also a committee for the prevention of torture in Africa, and the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. And then internationally, the United Nations also has special rapporteurs. I know that last year, 2 rapporteurs were invited to the country, and I'm sure that we can actually look at other mechanisms that could assist us, especially in the investigation of abductions, so that we do not end up with the fake abductions and the self-infliction of abductions and torture. And the last thing that I want to talk about, Chris, is the fact that it is important that there is acknowledgement that there is a crisis. Unless we are able to acknowledge that we have got a crisis, we are not able to attend and look at solutions that can actually remove us from the crisis. There are a lot of stakeholders who have looked at solutions, and one of the stakeholders is the National Convergence Platform that has proposed a comprehensive national settlement that looks at inclusive participation, non-partisanship, local ownership, consensus-based, holistic solutions, and people-centered. And I think that's an important aspect that will actually focus on victims, and in particular, women, as I was looking at the subject of women. Thank you.
So much, Justina, for that very comprehensive view of seeing women also as victims in this crisis and their specific role and agency in what has happened. I think what was particularly striking about what you have shared and also what Thandekile has shared with us is really around deficits in constitutionalism, the rule of law, human rights, as themes that seem to flow through the presentations that you have given us today. And I think it's a good point where we can bring in Professor Nick Cheeseman. Professor Cheeseman, you know, we've heard what some of the problems are, and a lot of them are structural in nature. You're a professor of democracy, and Justina says one of the first things that we have to do is to acknowledge that there is a crisis. Is there a crisis in Zimbabwe, Professor Cheeseman?
There is a clear crisis in Zimbabwe, but I think one of the things that's really interesting for those of us who've been watching Zimbabwe for a long time is how long this crisis has been going on. I mean, been various points, maybe over the last 10, 15 years, when we might have said, this surely is the crisis moment that brings down this regime. And somehow the regime has held on. We could go back to the 2008 elections. We could talk about the cholera outbreak. We could talk about hyperinflation. We could talk about where we are now today with a massive currency crisis, hyperinflation once again rearing its head, a government that has failed to deliver repeatedly on promises that it's made. And yet, despite the crisis kind of being ongoing, this regime has somehow managed to hold on. And I think one of the really interesting things about ZANU-PF is its longevity and how long it's managed to survive in crisis mode. In many countries, we might have expected by now, you know, some collapse, some rift, and yet it's still going. And I think to understand that and why it's still in power, we perhaps need to take, you know, a step back and just to remind ourselves how Mnangagwa became president. And of course, he didn't become president by holding an election. He didn't become president because of some internal democratic process. He basically became president because Robert Mugabe moved against him and his allies. And in response, he and his allies effected a coup. And that coup basically involved the military taking over power, forcing Mugabe out, and then easing Mnangagwa in, all the while trying to make it look like it wasn't a coup so they could avoid international sanctions. But it was very clearly a coup. And that has made a really big difference to the trajectory of Zimbabwean politics. Because what we now have is not simply, you know, a civilian regime with a very strong military attached. We now have a civil military complex that is at the heart of government. And that's a process that's been happening for perhaps 20 years, to some extent from the beginning of Zimbabwe's independence, but it's really been accelerated through this coup when we, of course, have people who were involved in organizing the coup and putting Mnangagwa in power now becoming positions like vice president and so on. And I think one of the things that's really important to keep in mind is how much this now constrains what President Mnangagwa himself can do. So, you know, what would be your advice to Mnangagwa if you wanted to actually reform your way out of the current situation? Well, you'd probably say you need to have some democratizing reforms to win back credibility internationally and domestically. And you probably also need to sort out the economy. You need to sort out the currency. You need to sort out key sectors of the economy. You need to get Zimbabwe back working again. The problem in both of those reforms, though, is that they go against key military interests. The idea of allowing for democracy and justice and prosecutions threatens the people that have been committing the human rights violations we've been hearing about. So they will not permit it. Dealing with and rationalizing the Zimbabwean economy means moving against the military, who have infected many sectors of the economy, buying up many companies, extending their tentacles into many corporations. Many of the problems Zimbabwe has with things like fuel, etc., are directly related to the role that both family members of the ZANU-PF elite and the military are playing within those parts of the economy. To actually get those parts of the economy working properly would mean removing the influence in them that military and ZANU-PF figures have. And again, they're unwilling to allow that to happen. So Mnangagwa, I think, is a relatively weak president in a sort of strong state. He can do these kind of knee-jerk violent activities. He can intimidate people. He can use the security forces, but he actually doesn't have much scope. And I think there's a really open question that many of us are working through, which is, is Mnangagwa really in power? Is he the power behind the throne? Or is Chiwenga the power behind the throne? Or is another military figure the power behind the throne? And if Mnangagwa, pushes too far in one direction, will we actually see a coup where the military effectively follow through with the beginning of the coup we saw that removed Mugabe, that was all about actually protecting and entrenching their own interests? And I think in that context, sadly, the prediction you would make is that things in Zimbabwe are probably going to get worse before they're going to get better. Because the people who are at the heart of that system, that civil military complex now, are not going to be prepared to simply lose power in an election or to lose power because of mass demonstrations. Because for them, holding on to power is a matter of life or death. It's what stops them from being prosecuted for the corruption and the human rights abuses they've committed over the past 10 years. That then means, I think, that sadly, we're probably going to see prolonged struggle, prolonged opposition mobilization, combined with prolonged state repression. And it's hard to see an easy or swift resolution coming up soon. I think what's really exciting about the last few months is that we've seen different kinds of protest. I've written about what we might call kind of personal demonstrations or patchwork protests, where individuals all across the country who are not allowed to go to an urban area to hold a mass protest because the government simply won't permit it. And if they go, they'll simply be beaten and arrested, but take photos of themselves, videos of themselves, share them on Twitter, share them on Facebook, and through hundreds of individuals, thousands of individuals doing that individually, often privately, sometimes anonymously, you actually see there's a wall of opposition to Mnangagwa. You understand how strong and deep the resentment and opposition is. And of course, that's gone hand in hand with the Zimbabwean Lives Matter Twitter hashtag, which has trended in the UK and the US, as well as in Zimbabwe itself. So I think all of these are really exciting, new, revitalizing ways of protesting in the context of an authoritarian state while trying to keep people safe. And they're clearly embarrassing the governments around the world, although that doesn't necessarily mean that the government would, change policies. As we've seen, despite all of those protests, we still see people like Hopo Chinono and others on trial, and we still see a number of political prisoners. That protest has been very effective, but sadly hasn't forced the government to change tack. I think the big challenge now for the opposition, and perhaps here I'll lead into Tendai, is that the government has become very adept at manipulating the opposition itself. And one of the perhaps slightly new phases we've seen over the last few months, perhaps since the last election, is the deliberate use of kind of lawfare, the manipulation of the rule of law, to effectively advance a faction of the opposition, which appears to be, doing the bidding of ZANU-PF and marginalizing the Nelson Chamisa-led opposition, which performed reasonably well at the last election and appeared to have some momentum. So one of the biggest challenges for Tendai and his colleagues is that not only are they fighting an effective authoritarian regime on one hand, but they're constantly having to fight these internal battles over who has the right to use the party name, who has the right to use the party building, who has the right to use party resources at the same time. And of course, we're now in a controversy over both the party name and the recall of MPs, as the question of who actually owns the MPs and the seats comes to the fore. And all of that is being fermented by a state that is deliberately attempting to undermine the Chamisa-led opposition bloc by supporting other factions of the opposition. And I think the real challenge for the opposition here is twofold. It's one, can the opposition come out of this with perhaps a new branding and a new kind of framing that leaves all of that baggage behind? Maybe it's time to leave the name MDC behind, and for Chamisa and his colleagues to form a new political vehicle with a new name that puts clear blue water and sort of finishes with some of these controversies. But the other point that's critical is, to try and form that opposition unity that is often so elusive. And, just to give you the figures, because I did some research on this last year, when there is no opposition coalition, So there's no coalition between the main two parties. Opposition parties in Africa win 13% of elections. So they lose 87% of elections with no coalition. When there is a coalition between the two main opposition parties win about 50% of elections. So 1 in 2. So the difference between really a 10% chance of winning and a 50% chance of winning is being able to form that united opposition. And it's the divisions in the opposition are one of the key things that allows, poorly performing governments to stay in power. So I think the really big challenge here is, how do you turn this brilliant, inspirational set of individual personal demonstrations that we've seen over the last few weeks on Twitter and Facebook into a new vehicle united behind perhaps a new party or a new movement with a new name that can really then be that force that pushes ZANU-PF out. But as I say, I think if we look at the way that President Mnangagwa came to power, we have to understand that he's going to have to be forced out. He's not going to go willingly, and others around him will not allow him to go willingly. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Cheeseman. You've really raised some fundamental points, particularly around this complex issue of Zimbabwe's civil-military relations. I like what you said. Is Zimbabwe a case of having a weak president in a strong state, where civil-military relations and indeed the dominance of the state security apparatus might help us find ways to unlock this conundrum? And certainly, I know Dr. Ibo Mandaza has commented around this quite extensively, and certainly we invite you, Dr. Mandaza, to join in the conversation right now and maybe shed some light into deficiencies maybe of the opposition also, and this question of Zimbabwe's civil-military relations. Over to you, Dr. Mandaza.
Thanks, Chris, and good afternoon to all of you, all the new colleagues, home colleagues. I think the previous 3 speakers have helped very much to explain the crisis in Zimbabwe. And so my role is really to try and summarize the factors that define the crisis in Zimbabwe, which is both a political and economic crisis, essentially. Political, a few years ago, in 2016 to be precise, I did a paper on the political economy of the state in Zimbabwe and spoke about the rise of the securocrat state. We also predicted that the security state would morph into what became an open military state in 2017 through the coup that Professor Cheeseman has referred to. So the main features of the securocrat state, military state, is that it is devoid of democratic credentials, first and foremost. There's the absence of the basic requirements of a democratic dispensation. And one way of highlighting that is to compare Zimbabwe with the other countries in the region. I drove over the weekend to Nyanga and back, and I was struck by the overpresence of the military at police roadblocks. Military brandishing guns along the highway. This never used to be in Zimbabwe. Certainly not before the coup. The open flaunting of military threat, force to instill fear in the population is reminiscent of the conventional military doctrine, which reads very simple. The only way to keep people who are against you, who vote against you repeatedly, who would want you out of power, is to batter them into submission. And that is the military doctrine of the securocrat state, in short. So there is no accountable executive. Cheeseman just mentioned that Emerson Mnangagwa was not elected, but the man before him, Mugabe, lost every election since 2002. And through the military and through the help of some neighbors, he came back to power again and again. Secondly, there's no vibrant legislature, mainly because the electoral process is tainted and therefore the results are dubious. So even the 2/3 majority that ZANU-PF claims to have in parliament has to be questioned given the nature of disputed elections in Zimbabwe since 2000. Not to mention the decimation, systematic decimation of the opposition, which is taking place. There is no independent judiciary. This has been pointed out. And right now, I'm sure Tendai Bichu will have more to say about that as a lawyer himself. There are no independent national institutions. I was a member of the Public Service Commission in the 80s. When such institutions were independent, even the military, I was in the Defense Forces Commission, they were independent and non-partisan. This is not the case anymore. In short, to use your own term, Chris, there's a deficit of constitutionalism, rule of law, and in its place, there is open violence, growing violence. Violence takes place even in spite of regional scrutiny, international glare of scrutiny, because the state cannot help itself. It can only stay in power by being violent. The abductions are a necessary form of staying in power. It's a reflection of the military doctrine I referred to. And of course, Professor Chisman says that this has gone on for a long time. But I want to remind him that the coup itself of 2017 marks a very important stage in the decline and deterioration of this cyclical state. And you have seen, if it's 3 years, it's a state going one way, having to rely on violence more and more, and incapable of reform for the reasons that Professor Chisman has stated. You cannot, Jonathan Moyo, when he was still a minister in government, he says, don't expect us to reform ourselves out of power. That is the basic. So when we say that the Zimbabwe state is incapable of reform politically, we mean precisely that. So yes, I have no doubt that it is a state in decline politically, that it will not even get to 2023, in my view, and that therefore there is need for some kind of intervention, mediation, because the violence will continue, abductions will continue, people will continue to suffer, and there is no expectation that the state will reform itself. I said the crisis is both political and economic. The economic features of it are very evident, and I'm sure Tendai would highlight that more as a former Minister of Finance. But for me, one of the key indicators of an economy in this serious distress is the fact that 75% of all professional and skilled Zimbabweans are outside the country. 75% and growing. How many countries can survive, reform, recover with such statistics? You have a country, you talked about predatory state, this predatory state by excellence, Zimbabwe, where now the economy, whatever's left of it is cartel economy. The rule of the comprador bourgeoisie, the civil, military, security, bureaucratic class. We have curtailed the fuel and energy industry, the mining industry, the financial sector, and the looting and is become a frenzy because we have, true to the class of comprador, it's a class without national interest because it's incapable of conceiving such. There's a bunch of thieves, basically. They're very insecure. They live for today. They have no hope of tomorrow. So the stealing becomes a frenzy. These are people who have no investment in the country. I mean, there's a case, Peter Nyang Nyongo came to give the Pan-African lecture at Surface 3 years ago. And the arrival at the airport in Harare, he said he was shocked. He saw no cranes, like you see in other countries, in Ethiopia, in South Africa, in Zambia. And he said that's what $15 billion from the diamond sector alone. Where is it? It's obviously it's out there. It's stashed away because there's no evidence of it at home in terms of investment. This is the nature of the class that runs our country at home. So, in conclusion, on my part, we're glad that since 31st of July, a non-event in terms of the expected major demonstration, it nevertheless become the eye of the storm that has provoked regional and international factors into an acute awareness of the crisis in Zimbabwe, like never before. We, as you know, we had in 23rd of July, the Surplus Trust Policy Dialogue looked at the South Africa-Zimbabwe relations. And we asked the question, is it a case of the tail wagging the dog, indifference, incapacity, or neighbor harvesting a neighbor's economic woes? The conclusion on 23rd of July was that South Africa is unlikely to do anything. They're too preoccupied with their own problems. So what has changed? A week later, 31st of July, things changed. 6th of August, Ramaphosa announced the envoy is going to Harare. On the 9th, they arrived in Harare. On the same day, the UN issued a statement on the crisis in Zimbabwe. The same day, the AU issued a statement on the crisis in Zimbabwe. Since then, we have clearly at least mediation on the part of South Africa in Zimbabwe. And we welcome that very much because I think the kind of social, regional and international response is important in arresting the slide into more and more violence against a fearful population. I don't think that we should ever discuss the usual scenario that all Zimbabweans are too docile. Zimbabweans have done everything, and they'll continue to do that. But do we have to wait to see more deaths, more abductions? I think the action taken by South Africa is important, and it really depends on us Zimbabweans, how we combine our forces at home in putting more and more pressure on the regime. We must expect and hope for mediation in the coming weeks. Mediation by South Africa, but also with the umbrella of the SADC and AU. And the kind of scaffolding that we require will be required from the international community. In a mediation that also must involve, as Justina and Dendeka mentioned earlier on, that we may have to go into the kind of peace arrangements that we did at Lancaster, including amnesty, peace, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, to deal with the atrocities since independence. Kukuraundi, Muramba China, 2008 killings, August the 1st, 2018 killings, the violence of 2019, the current abductions. These are very important factors. And I know that the issue of the ICC, the threat of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, has always hung over Zimbabwe. And we know that South Africa, in previous years, certainly, I'm aware that the South African General's report of 2008, which I had sight of on the plane sitting next to Romano, it has never been published. But if it's ever published, it will be an additional and viable testimony to the kind of atrocities that the former liberation movement has meted up against its own people. It is a serious indictment with the history of our liberation struggle, that we can mete out the kind of violence that we have been able to mete out, the kind of violence that we have seen in Kukuraundi. I remember asking one of the generals in 1982, I said, why are we doing this during Kukuraundi? Our people went through the same thing during the war. Why are we doing the same to our own people? And he said, Igbo, you don't understand the military. You are just a civilian, even though you are a member of the liberation movement. The military doctrine says the only way to deal with those who are opposed to you is to batter them into submission. And that's what has been happening. Thank you.
Dr. Mandaza, fascinating. Thank you for your insights and for sharing those observations. And let's bring in here the Honorable Tendai Biti. Honorable Biti, you know, many questions are being raised here about the suitability, let's call it even the viability of the opposition in Zimbabwe when faced with such a consistent and persistent, let's call it rival in the form of ZANU-PF and the blurring of the lines between the state and indeed this political party. What's your view about this? Is the opposition viable at all?
Well, thank you, Chris. I think to answer that question, let's put the context which those colleagues who have spoken before me have brilliantly outlined. The issue of conflict, issues of transitional justice, which Tandikile spoke about, the issues around the women's struggle, which Justina Mukoko spoke about. What she didn't testify is her own ordeals, the torture that she went through at the hands of the regime, unbelievable, unspeakable. I've been fortunate or unfortunate to act for another woman who was arrested the time that Justina was arrested, Consilia Chinanjawana. And one of the stories in her affidavit is that for 40 days, she was brutalized in a CIO house, not police custody, but basically brigand custody, where for 40 days they essentially abused her, sexually and otherwise, and so this is the kind of thing that we are seeing in Zimbabwe. Apartheid was terrible, but this regime is unique in the systematic use of rape as a political women. So the human rights abuses that has continued against our people, unmitigated, unabated, is unacceptable. There are 4 things that characterize Zimbabwe after 2017. And we need to take those into account. Number 1 is the rise of the securocratic state that Dr. Mandaza speaks of. Before 2017, November was the pretense of a civilian infrastructure controlling a military and subject to the people of Zimbabwe, subject to recall through elections. But that myth was debunked by November 2017, when those that had been running the state since 1980 openly and flagrantly took the reins of state power. So you have a complicated situation now. Either we had party-state conflation. Now we have a total takeover by the military and the total emasculation of every institution in Zimbabwe to the military. It doesn't matter whether it's the judiciary, it doesn't matter whether it's a parliament, it doesn't matter whether the executive itself, it doesn't matter whether it's our Chapter 13 commissions, which are the equivalent to a Chapter 9 commissions. You will hardly find any institution in Zimbabwe which is not run or controlled by the military, whether it's parastatal or not. I used to be Minister of Finance key departments like the budget department, they're now soldiers, running that. And this is a very unfortunate development, a very unfortunate development. As a corollary to this issue of the rise of the securocratic state is that the men, and largely men, there are no women, that have committed and have been associated with the ugliest parts of Zimbabwean history are now openly in charge of the state. Tandikile spoke of Gukurahundi, where 30,000 people were killed in the south of the country, largely in Matebeleland. That Gukurahundi was led and executed by Emmerson Mnangagwa, who was Minister of State Security, by the late Parents Shiri, who was commander of the 5th Brigade, and our just departed Minister of Lands and Agriculture. Vice President Constantine Chiwenga led the brigade in Bulawayo. These are the people that are now controlling, the state openly, openly. The second issue that we must understand is the rise and entrenchment of corruption. So 2 things now matter in Zimbabwe. Number 1, the power retention agenda. So decisions and policy is subject to the power retention agenda. And the second is the bottom line. What's in it for me? It's my time to eat is the book that Michelle Wong wrote on Kenya. I chair the Public Accounts Committee. I never thought that what I'm seeing in that capacity was possible. Even if one tried to write a novel, you couldn't imagine the kind of brigand looting that is taking place in our country. In 2017, $2.5 billion was stolen directly through treasury. In 2018, $3.5 billion was stolen directly through treasury. Right now, before Parliament, there is a financial adjustment bill in respect of which the government is seeking condonation for stealing, for spending outside Parliament, the sum of $10.6 billion. The non-proclaimed budget deficits, where someone, the Secretary for Treasury, he has refused to come before us, and yesterday we issued him with a warrant of arrest for disrespecting a parliament. So if you add the amount of money that comes into Zimbabwe in terms of foreign direct investment, which is around $200 million, diaspora remittances around $800 million, overseas development assistance aid around $5 million, it takes you to around $1.5 billion. That's less than the looting. $2.7 billion in 2017, $3.5 billion in 2018. They have not produced the audited statements for 2019. And one of the reasons why they will not do so in a hurry is because 2019 was worse than 2018 and 2017. They stole like their own steroids in 2019. I was having a private chat with one of the accountants in one of the ministries, and she says, "My friend, you have never seen anything like 2019 is." So corruption has become at the nervous center of Zimbabwean politics, because the same people who are controlling the state are the same people involved in this massive corruption. There are 7 commanding heights of corruption, if I may call them that. Number 1 is fuel, the fuel cartels. There's a dominant character called Kudata Gurei, a dominant company called Sekunda, a dominant company called Traffic Bura, Russian-owned. It controls the pipeline. It controls the importation of every drop of fuel that comes into the country. Then on the retail sector, there are essentially 3 companies selling fuel in Zimbabwe. Zuva, which has got connections to Emmerson Mnangagwa, Sekunda, Tagwirei, Puma, same company. So that fuel. Then you have got the cartel of foreign currency. The Reserve Bank controls foreign currency, but these guys have captured the Reserve Bank. They've cannibalized the Reserve Bank. When I was Minister of Finance, we dollarized the economy. The US dollar and the South African rand became the currency of the day. Over the past few years, they've de-dollarized now. We've gone back to our own currency. When you do that now, they've commodified the US dollar. So the US dollar is now a commodity with use value and exchange value. Right now, as I'm talking to you, the parallel exchange rate is around 112 to 120. The official auction rate, which is rigged, is around 70 to 80. Now that premium now, that difference between the parallel market and the official exchange rate is where the cartels are found, is where the sharks are. Because sharks will always be there where arbitrage is. Third issue is our commodities. 15 billion US dollars worth of diamonds was stolen between 2010 and 2013. So 4 commodities are the prime targets: gold, platinum, chrome, and diamonds. And you find the same characters by name, physically, the same characters. Fifth, the arena of looting are non-commodity resources, national parks, wildlife. For Christ's sake, the president gives special grants to the Chinese to mine in national parks, in Hwange National Park. So in 40 years' time, Zimbabwean children would have to go to Kruger National Park to watch an elephant, to watch a lion, because they are busy selling our ivory, busy selling our hard trees, busy selling our crocodiles, busy selling our elephants, busy selling our zebras. The rot, the loot is unmitigated. Next are tenders. I can write a book about tenders. You guys speak of state capture and tenderpreneurs in South Africa. We invented state capture in Zimbabwe. You guys are amateurs. The rule book, we've written the rule book here in Zimbabwe. So that's corruption. The third thing is that you have got a ruling class without ruling ideas. You see, under Emerson Mnangagwa, you have got a group that lacks both democratic legitimacy and performance legitimacy. There are some countries in Africa that lack the democratic discourse. Rwanda, for instance, Egypt, for instance, but there's performance legitimacy. There's performance legitimacy in Ethiopia. Look at GDP growth rate, look at massive growth in infrastructure. The same applies to Rwanda, the same applies to Egypt under Sisi. But in Zimbabwe, we lack both performance legitimacy and the democratic legitimacy, which is very rare. You have to be such an idiot to suffer a deficit, to suffer a kwashioka of any performance criteria. So we've got totally incompetent brigands that are not located in any ideology, in any value system. Just to give you one example.
But Honorable, you know, it's interesting, and I just want to bring you back here, back to the question of the opposition itself.
I'm coming there.
And this question is asked very nicely by Tatenda Mangena, who says,
just be patient. I'm coming there. It's the fourth issue.
He says, but let me ask you, Honorable. He says, but what is the role of the main opposition, for which you, Honorable Biti, are a key component? And he says, is it working? Can it work? And he says, can we put our hopes in elections, or should the masses take to the streets? Nothing is worse than ZANU-PF, not even the gun. So he's asking a pointed question, and I think this is the frustration. A lot of narratives about what the governing party is doing. What is the opposition, especially MDC Alliance?
Yeah, I'm coming. I'm number 3. I'm coming to number 4. There is something that offends me as a Zimbabwean, which is a reflection of what I said: a ruling party, a ruling elite without ruling ideas, that is vacuous, that is not grounded in any ideology or in any value system. It is the $3.5 billion global compensation to former commercial farmers. The land reform program happened in 2000. It was violent. The constitution says you can't compensate. You can't compensate. This government, in its wisdom, signs a $3.5 billion to compensate these people. Outside parliament, there's been no parliamentary approval. There's no act of parliament, which is required in section 294, that determines how you access the compensation for improvement. We don't have the money anyway. 95% of our people are unemployed. 79% are living in extreme poverty, surviving on less than US $1.20 a day. 10 million Zimbabweans need humanitarian assistance. 4 million of those are found in South Africa in your restaurants. 5,000 are trying to cross crocodile-infested Limpopo on a day-to-day basis. Why sign this agreement? That's an example of the vacuousness of Emmerson Mnangagwa. The average Zimbabwean will tell you that we jumped from the pot in 2017 into a fire, and that fire is Emmerson Mnangagwa, a clueless fascist, a brigand. Now I come to the question of the opposition, which is my fourth point, that no one is safe in Zimbabwe. You have got these fascists that have unleashed terror, coercion, and fear against everyone. It doesn't matter whether it's the Catholic Church. It doesn't matter whether it's journalists like Hope or Chingono. It doesn't matter whether it's 3 little girls in the MDC, Cecilia Chimpiri, Joanna Mamombe, Notsai Maroa. It doesn't matter whether it's a young student, Tafadzwa Ngadzure. It doesn't matter whether it's an old man like Sekuru Ibo Mandaza there. No one is safe. It doesn't matter whether it's the ANC or the South African government. No one is safe. Now, with the MDC alliance, we are being punished for beating Emmerson Mnangagwa in 2018. Nelson Chamisa is being punished for getting more votes, 2.6 million, than Emmerson Mnangagwa. So there is now a deliberate attempt to totally obliterate us. They've taken away our name. They've taken away our MPs. They've taken away through the army, the head office. I'm a lawyer and a decent lawyer for that matter. Law judgments are being rewritten on jurisprudence that I don't know, that the law school didn't teach me. And trust me, I know 1 or 2 things about the law. But the MDC alliance is grounded in the people of Zimbabwe. It doesn't matter whether you go to Cholocho, to Bubi, to Nkai, to Odzani, to Mutare, to Chendambuya, to Lotito. The party that Morgan Tsvangirai built is alive and kicking. So we'll go through these phases, but the people are out there. The people are out there. The people are out there. So we cannot discount the role of democratic discourse guaranteed by our constitution simply because fascism wants to obliterate us as the MDC alliance, and will remain peaceful and in the trenches. However, when you close political space, when you shut down political space, when you stop people from breathing and you have their legs on their necks, they will found unconstitutional avenues of catharsis. The valve will break, and that's where Zimbabwe is right now at the moment. There's going to be an implosion, which is why dialogue that Dr. Mandaza speaks of, it's so important, because dialogue offers a soft landing for Zimbabwe. Dialogue offers a soft opportunity for Zimbabwe. The alternative and the inevitable alternative is another implosion, an implosion in the form of another military coup, and that's not academic, or an implosion in our people going on the streets to say enough is enough. And because Emmerson is bloodthirsty, and because the soldiers are already on the streets, there will be a bloody implosion. When you look at Emmerson Mnangagwa, you are looking at Idi Amin. You are looking at Pol Pot, the West amongst the West. Thank you very much.
Honorable BT, thank you, and apologies for jumping in here. I'm just mindful of the time and the fact that we are encouraging people to use the question and answer facility here on Zoom in order to pose some questions. And we've got a number. And I want to direct this one back to Thandekile Moyo, where we began. and it's from Chrissy Dube. She says the Zimbabwean population seems powerless at this stage, as there is no accountability, no justice under the ruling regime. What recommendations can the panel make, especially you, Thandegile, for global authorities to intervene in the crisis in Zimbabwe? Is there even an opportunity for such intervention from the international community? Thandegile.
Okay, so I think what I'll first address, thanks for the question, is the assertion that Zimbabweans are powerless to change the situation. So I think that's what the problem is. The Zimbabweans are the only people that actually have the power to change the situation. There is nobody that can come from outside and change the situation for us. So as it stands, you'll find that all the avenues to change our government are closed, as Mr. Beatty explained earlier. Under normal circumstances, we'd just wait for 2023 and say we're going to change our government in 2023. Or when we lost in 2018, as we did, we'd go to court and say we voted for this president, but what happened? The election was rigged, but the judiciary is captured. The Electoral Commission is captured. So the only avenue left now to change our government is the power of the people. I'm of the opinion that people now have to exercise Section 67 of the Constitution that says we have the right to challenge government. We can challenge government in any peaceful manner. And the only peaceful manner that I see right now is peaceful protests, a peaceful uprising against the government of Zimbabwe. How the international community can now help is because, as Tendai Biti explained earlier, we are dealing with a bloodthirsty government. We know that when we get into the streets, the government is going to kill us. So we then need the international community now to try and help us have a peaceful uprising and be ready to intervene when it gets bloody, because it definitely will get bloody.
Yeah, and that really brings in the next question here from Colin Ngudu. This is for Prof. Cheeseman, and it's almost linked to what Thandegile was saying to us now. And the question here is Zimbabwe not past the remain and reform stage and only left with revolution or rebellion to change the system? And if so, how best can the people of Zimbabwe organize such a revolution?
It's a good question. I think, we look at the system and we compare it to other countries that might be in a roughly similar position. Think about maybe Belarus right now. You see two things that generally end up changing those situations. The first is a major rift within the ruling party and a faction of the ruling party defecting, or perhaps, as we saw in countries like Egypt, the military stepping aside and refusing to defend the ruling party and to almost supporting the protests. We saw something like that happen in Malawi earlier this year. The problem is, of course, that the military is what we're talking about as being the heart of the regime. So the idea of that split or the military standing aside just isn't going to happen. The second then is mass public protests, sustained protests day after day after day. The problem, of course, in Zimbabwe is we've seen that in the past, but the government is simply shutting it down with absolute brutality, shooting protesters, preventing protesters from being able to form in urban areas. It probably is, sadly, going to take that kind of sustained mass action to generate the change that people would like to see in Zimbabwe. The reason why I think it's really difficult to advocate that or to encourage that is because we know it means people will die. People will have to die to generate that kind of change because the regime is so reluctant. And I think that's a really dangerous and scary situation. The one thing that could perhaps change that situation is if we saw really concerted international action. But I think, as other speakers have said, we just saw an ANC delegation to Zimbabwe that was supposed to meet with the opposition that wasn't allowed to and was sent packing within 48 hours. So, concerted international intervention could do something, but we've had 10, 20 years of this and we haven't seen that yet. So I do worry that it will require a form of revolution where the losers will be the people who have to go on the streets.
Yeah, and here, Dr. Ibo Mandaza, you've got a question from Ndumiso Koza, who says, Dr. Mandaza, you talked about mediation, but the problem is ZANU-PF doesn't honor agreements. For example, Lancaster House Agreement, the Unity Accord, the 2008 GPA. So we can't say this time they will honor any agreement. It's not in the DNA of the governing party in Zimbabwe, especially now, given the fact that it seems like they are not just a government with an army, but it's really an army with a government.
Yes, I agree that to some extent ZANU-PF has become an appendage of the military. But that in turn explains the inherent weakness of ZANU-PF, or whatever is left of it. I believe that in the next few weeks, with the requisite pressure, one, the economic situation which they cannot reverse ever, and there could be no improvement in the economy at all without inflows of either FDIs or support, balance of payment support, combined with the situation in which Emerson Mnangagwa is a beleaguered man. He doesn't control ZANU-PF at all. He's divided ethnically, fatally so. I think that it's a different ZANU-PF from the one of 2008, which went to the GNU with the mediation of South Africa. I think it's a very weak ZANU-PF, and I think that it's amenable. It is on the ropes, and I think among themselves they know that it's time up, and they'll be looking for a settlement in which they can save their lives without ICC, save some of the loot, as happened to Abacha, but I know that they are ready to negotiate, and the mediation is something they can work now. No doubt about that.
And here, Justina Mokoko, Mamadou Sakira asks the following. He says, faced with manipulation of the press in this crisis, are social networks a credible alternative to denounce the violation of human rights that you have so eloquently illustrated in your presentation?
Thank you very much for that question. And indeed, social networks are a force to reckon with. I am saying this because the government and ZANU-PF have invested deeply in having people who are on Twitter, who are spinning on their behalf. And I think we even saw how the hashtag Zimbabwean Lives Matter trended, and it's on Twitter, where we have also recorded responses from the government and also from ZANU-PF. So in my view, they might actually say a lot of things that are coming out on social media should not be taken as fact, but they are also investing in responding to those issues. So I think it's a credible route that can be used to create awareness and also to denounce violations of human rights.
100%, and thanks for that, Justina. We've got Rukudzo Kalari here, and she says, Honorable BT, how can we create alternative spaces where citizens can converge and fully come up with a shared position of action to correct all of these wrongs? It does appear that the politics in Zimbabwe are very simplistically binary. It's either you're ZANU-PF or MDC. Is there a third way? Is there a place where people can converge and discuss these issues of national importance in the national interest? Honorable BT.
Yes, I think that where we are right now, we are back to the kind of dislocation and disequilibrium that you associated with the informal collapse of the settler colonialism around the late 50s and early 60s in Southern Rhodesia, this country. You know, things were not working. and Africans came to the conclusion that we all have to come together to fight the regime. And I think at the stage where we are in right now, the political party, the political movement, the MDC is important. There's no question about that. But I think it's time that we converged, we create a new narrative, a new consensus, where we converged. Under Morgan Trangirai, in 2007, we did converge and formed what was called the Save Zimbabwe, Alliance, which was actually led by the church. We were part of it as the political party, but there were key voices. And I think we've gotten to that level where we need that broad front, that broad alliance, because it's now a crisis that's beyond a party. It's now a crisis that is cutting across the length and breadth of Zimbabwe. It's irrespective of class, irrespective of tribe. But I also think that our methods need to change. The tools that we have used need to change. There is Section 59 of our Constitution, which speaks of our right to demonstrate. That provision allows for civil disobedience, allows for the citizen to say no to their businesses, no to their industries, no to their institutions. So essentially, we need to change gears to force a political settlement in Zimbabwe. And ultimately, a peaceful political settlement will actually save lives. As I said, it's important that we have this a dialogue. Part of changing tact is also learning from the mistakes of 2008. In 2008, we had an agreement, the global political agreement, that gave rise to the government of national unity. That construct was a one-size-fits-all. That was a solution that came with President Mbeki. Now we need structural reforms. We need deep-rooted structural reforms, constitutional reforms, political reforms, economic reforms that will make sure that, including the issue of transitional justice that Tandikile brilliantly spoke about. In other words, we need to address those issues that make Zimbabwe a contested space for four decades. What are those issues? Once we agree on those issues, then let's discuss an implementation mechanism. Some of us call it a national transitional authority. Let's have that. And the task at hand, the task of implementing reforms, will determine the length of duration of the transitional mechanism. When we are past the transitional mechanism, then we can go to another election. This time, a proper, a free, legitimate, credible election. But that has not happened. We've been stuck with the over 15 elections in 40 years. All those elections have actually cemented conflict, cemented division, cemented bloodshed. We are tired of that. We want a permanent, lasting, disruptive solution, a consensus solution, the restoration of the social contract. But this requires deep dialogue and the resolution of deep structural issues, not superficial issues that we dealt with in 2008 in the global political agreement. So in summary, I'm urging two issues: a new approach towards how we confront the states, and a new solution, lasting solution, to put a full stop to the Zimbabwean question.
Fantastic. Prof. Cheeseman, what's interesting here is that Honorable Beatty talked or alluded to a national transitional authority space to create dialogue and consensus around a transition, the next steps. But in doing so, aren't we replicating the mistakes of the past? Because that would require a suspension of democratic principles, legal frameworks, possible elections, going to another situation of illegitimacy in order to resolve these long-standing, deep structural issues. Aren't we repeating the same mistakes?
I think the key question for me is, can you actually do an arrangement like that that leaves those currently in power with a bit of power so that their worst kind of nightmares are averted, but relieves them of the key decision-making authority. If you can do that, if you can pull off that trick, then a transitional authority might work very well. And something like that, you know, obviously worked in South Africa if we go back to 1994 and the first government, which was a coalition government. But if you can't do that, then you're absolutely right. And the key lesson here is Zimbabwe's own. It's the Zimbabwe power sharing arrangement when, you know, although Changarai allowed to retain the presidency. Tendai Biti was taken into government in a very important role, but many of the Zimbabwean leaders, MDC leaders, were taken into government in less weighty roles in terms of political power than the ZANU-PF figures. And what came out of that was a new constitution, but a constitution that in many ways didn't go far enough and left Robert Mugabe in power. And many years on, we're still here talking about ZANU-PF. So I think what would be really important, and your question basically hinted at this, is to avoid the power sharing experience Zimbabwe has already had and to have a deal that really does wrest power away. The problem is, I see at the minute, it seems very unlikely that ZANU-PF would agree to that, because even if certain civilian figures would, the military would perhaps act as a veto player and prevent that deal from being done. So my sense is that the deal that you would need to do that would really allow that transitional authority to allow for democratization is probably off the table right now.
So Dr. Mandaza Webster Zambara, in the same kind of train of thought, says, on the eve of the 2018 elections, our Afro barometer research found that 60% of Zimbabweans supported a government of national unity. The call by MDCA has been for a genuine dialogue. Is a GNU government really possible? In 2009, it seemed impossible. So was it? So it was similar also in 1980. What are your opinions about this? I think problematizing this question again of GNUs, Professor Cheeseman says it needs to be off the table. As part of that transitional agreement, do you agree?
No, I think the circumstances are very different. 1980, 2008, and now. Very different. As I said earlier, that the ZANU-PF is a depleted party. It is not the same party that it was 40 years ago, nor even 20 years ago. And therefore, a GNU model will not work, in my view, because ZANU-PF as it stands is fatally divided. As the current fighting of the DCCs is showing. And therefore, the transitional authority is an appropriate mechanism, in my view, where you have a very weak ruling party, depleted ruling party, and also a decimated formal opposition. And in which case, therefore, whatever emerges must be a combination of whatever remains of ZANU-PF, MDC alliance, and representative of the civic society. And our proposal on the transitional authority was a conventional transitional authority in which you have people, 18 persons, heading the transitional authority, made up of persons about whom all parties, ZANU-PF, MDC alliance, civil society, agree as being the appropriate and suitable persons to lead the transitional authority until the next elections. These people would report to Parliament as a transitional authority. They would be in charge of the political and economic reform agenda, and the transitional authority will be scaffolded by the region and the international community. That's how we define it. It must be non-partisan in the sense that not even those of us who are calling for the transitional authority would not be members of it, and certainly not the formal members of political parties. I think it's possible. I think it is possible. You made the point earlier on about the legal impediments, constitutional impediments. I just want to remind you that when it came to the GNU in 2009, that was overcome by a schedule to the Constitution, which is approved by Parliament, and everything was fine. So I don't think there's any constitutional impediments. What is required is the political will. We know conventionally a transitional authority comes about as a peace treaty, like happened in Sudan last year. There's a transitional authority there. But there you have a situation where you have 4 civilians and 4 military and 6 civilians, 10 members, chaired by my colleague Hamdok. And I think we would, in the Zimbabwean situation, we would want the military back in the barracks with the return of constitutionalism under the transitional authority. That is in the way of a proposal. It's something that can be put on the table, and the mediator or mediators could deal with. And we're not sure, it's not cast in stone, but I think it's a working document that one can work with, because it also includes the issue of amnesties, truth and reconciliation commissions, and so on and so forth, and also the repatriation of looted funds out there as part of the economic recovery plan. And of course, the return of the diaspora. The diaspora I made reference to, at least some of them to come back home as investors and as active participants in the political and economic recovery of Zimbabwe.
So, Thandekile Moyo, Stephen Buchanan Clark here says, given what Dr. Mandaza has just said, what would be the permissible incentives that would help ZANU-PF honor agreements given its track record? Would this not simply add to your issue, which is the question of impunity again?
I think that if we give another get out of jail free card, we would actually be doing a disservice to all their victims over the decades, because transitional justice should never be some sophisticated way of achieving impunity, because desperate as we are for peace, if we want transitional justice, it must be victim-centered, as I explained earlier. So we cannot have a transition that is focused only on getting power from ZANU-PF, but has no real agenda of peace and reconciliation, because that is what's needed in the country right now. So I think whatever solution we need now has to focus on victims. It has to focus on justice. So for the first time in Zimbabwe, we need to have justice for all the atrocities that were committed. We can't keep on having a country that's founded on pain, that's founded on ignoring victims. It's unsustainable. It means 5 years from now, ZANU-PF will have gotten a new lease of life and they'll keep perpetrating those crimes. We can't have a man killing people from 1980 to 2020 and he gets away with it. And we keep giving them that get out of jail free card. I don't think it's justice. I don't see that as any form of justice.
Great, thanks, Thandi. I'm looking at the time right now, and I'm going to call on our distinguished group of panelists really to provide us in about 5 minutes each their final remarks, and maybe we can start off with Justina Mokoko. Your final remarks in about 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Chris. Before I do that, I also just wanted to look at some of the statistics that we have put together in terms of human rights violations that we are talking about. Looking at abductions, this we just took from November 2017 to August 2020, and we have recorded 101 cases of abductions. And the modus operandi for the majority of the abductions has been to abduct someone, torture them for several hours, and dump them. But we have also seen that modus operandi being changed for some of the people who have been subjected to abduction, where they have been kept for several days. But I think what is really, that's really concerning is the kind of inhuman treatment that a lot of these victims have gone through, where you will find that people have been made to drink their own urine. And there was a case where someone defecated and asked the victim to then clean up the place using his own hands. So is that kind of situation that we are having to deal with. And one was asked to, it was a sewage pond, and obviously they were going to swallow from the sewage pond. And we have seen a 22-year-old who was subjected to severe torture that resulted in him risking damage to his kidneys. So it's those kind of things that we are talking about. And around July 31, 2020, we recorded about 17 abductions. And then now looking at women affected by human rights violations in 2020, from January 2020 to August 2020, as an organization, the Zimbabwe Peace Project, we recorded 11,613 women whose rights were violated. And in the same period last year, we recorded about 5,647. So you can actually see the difference between the two. The year is not even out. And we are basically saying, let's come together and recognize that we have got a crisis. And there are ways for us to be able to get out of this crisis. But I think I will emphasize again that first and foremost, we need to acknowledge across the political divide, across all stakeholders, that we have got a crisis. Unless we do that, we will not be able to solve the crisis that is before us. And there is no way that we can wake up and have a good human rights record because it's soiled. We have to work hard in terms of ensuring that we are able to sanitize what we have got in relation to the human rights record that we have. It's not enough for people to say when there is an event, there are people who then do these things. I am basically saying don't violate those people's rights. If they are not violated, there won't be any reports and there won't be anything on your record. So I think we need to work together on this. And there are the several institutions that I spoke about that need to work hard for them to be able to ensure that they have regained
Sorry, Justina. I really apologize. It's just that time is not on our side, but
thank you very much.
We get the main thrust of your interventions. And in doing so, let's over to Dr. Mandaza, your final concluding remarks, please, in less than 5 minutes. Dr.
Just 3 points. Yeah.
Go ahead,
3
sir.
points. The first is that in highlighting the Zimbabwe crisis is to compare Zimbabwe with the rest of the region. Zimbabwe is the odd man out in the region. You don't see any military personnel on the streets of South Africa, Botswana, Zambia, Tanzania. The military are in the barracks as prescribed by the Constitution. Zimbabwe is clearly the odd man out. And a big mistake was made, therefore, by the region, SADC, and the AU, not to have raised the red card when the coup took place in November 2017. A big mistake, okay? Not to mention the fact that so much was invested in a man called Emerson Mnangagwa, who has turned out to be what we know him to be, a failure. So, number two, the abductions that Justina has highlighted so graphically. That's not happening anywhere in the region. It's only in Zimbabwe. And therefore, the Zimbabweans, the region, the international community are right to talk about a crisis, especially in the form that is taken in these abductions. They're terrible, you know? And I'm glad that this has raised the awareness of the region, of the continent, and the international community. And therefore, my last point is really, we should begin planning mediation. Mediation, which is all inclusive, includes the various parties, but also civic society, churches, the diaspora, where we have 6-7 million people out there. And that the mediation must be well organized to include SADC, the AU, with the scaffolding of the international community. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mandaza. Thandekile Moyo, back to you as your final concluding remarks, please.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, sorry. So I think what Zimbabweans need to realize is that the crisis we have is a crisis where there is an unlevel political playing field, and it disadvantages everybody. It disadvantages opposition political parties, it disadvantages civilians, it disadvantages everyone basically. So I think the time has come for political parties and the people to work together to level the playing field. And I think that's something like what Mr. Mandaza was talking about. By leveling the playing field, I mean, we should strengthen our institutions such that we have a ZEC that can have elections that are free and fair. We have anybody that wants to contest being able to contest in the election and become whatever they want to be. And the people also manage to choose the leaders that they want. So everything that is going on, MDC fighting for a name, everyone fighting for this and that, it's never going to be solved until we have a level political playing field. And that can only be achieved by removing the people that have captured the state. It should be a common goal for democracy. We cannot have a one-party state in 2020. I think, yeah, that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Mamoyo. I'm going to hand over to Prof. Cheeseman, your final remarks.
Thank you very much. I think my colleagues have already said a lot of what I would say. So I'll maybe just end by pointing out something that I think Honourable Tendai Biti said earlier and emphasizing that point. What we are now seeing with things being sold off, such as key areas of land, key areas of natural beauty, Zimbabwe's heritage, suggests that this is almost a government on tilt. There is nothing sacred. There is nothing that will be not sold off to investors who will provide probably less than the land is worth or the item is worth. And I think that brings home to us that this is not just a government that is hurting people in Zimbabwe today. This is a government that is hurting the people of Zimbabwe's children and its children's children. It's not just undermining their current economic context, but also the possibility for recovery, not just in a few years, but in 5, 10, 15, 20 years. The next government is already going to have to spend a lot of time simply undoing the mess that this government is doing. So it really is not just a question of democracy, but of urgency for the long-term development of Zimbabwe and the protection of its resources and lands, to find a way of holding the government accountable. And I think especially for the international community, multinational companies and others engaging in Zimbabwe, this is something that really needs to be at the forefront of their minds. It is an emergency in all senses of that word.
100%. Thank you so much, Prof. Cheeseman. And we'll give the final word to Honorable Biti in conclusion, sir, in 5 minutes. Please unmute, Honorable Biti.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah, look, I've got a message to President Ramaphosa, the leadership of the ANC, and of course to Zimbabweans, the African Union, the UN. The situation is urgent. The situation is drastic. the situation is on a knife edge. We are run, objectively and subjectively. We are run by a group of men and women without any restraint, without any elasticity, without any remorse, without any guilty conscience, what T.S. Eliot calls the hollow man. And so, as a result, the entirety of the state, its social fabric, is under threat. It doesn't matter whether it's the human rights discourse. It doesn't matter whether it's the economy. It doesn't matter whether it's our natural resources. We are under threat. So there is an obligation on President Ramaphosa, on South Africa, of providing the leadership, the external agents, the external refereeing, which we Zimbabweans are incapable of providing for obvious reasons. We need that soft landing to avoid that implosion. The failure to address Zimbabwe right now is that there's going to be a bloodbath, is that there's going to be illegal, unconstitutional responses to the crisis, which regrettably will cost people's lives. And much of this unlawful activity will actually start within the state itself as elite rupture, which is already there. The fight between the president and the vice president intensifies. So the situation is urgent. I don't know how I can put it. I live in Zimbabwe. I watch Emmerson Mnangagwa every day. The situation is out of control. The ruling elite are deranged. An urgent solution is called for.
So much on that sobering note. I think this is a good place for us really to wrap up our conversation today on the crisis in Zimbabwe. I think what is quite apparent is that what needs to be sought in Zimbabwe is that room for that transitional arrangements to be agreed upon by the various parties across the political and civil society divide in that country. Certainly, the international and regional community has a part to play. I think it's been very clearly articulated what that role could be. We at Good Governance Africa have really sought to bring together at this panel who have so well and so elaborately put forward some of the possible solutions, some of the possible ways forward for Zimbabwe. And we certainly want to thank them today for taking their time off their busy schedules to really share with us as we continue on our quest to find solutions to this multifaceted crisis in Zimbabwe. And on that note, as we run out of time, let me thank the team at Good Governance Africa for putting this together. And certainly, in conclusion, let me thank all of the participants who joined us today to take time to really reflect on some of these pressing and complex issues facing Zimbabwe. On that note, I want to say thank you for joining us and goodbye. Thank you so much.
I love you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Prof. Mandaza. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks.